Hello ladies and gentlemen of YouTube, this is Megneous and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program. It's been a very long time since we've played Kerbal Space Program, and since the update is coming up 0.22 very soon, I wanted to get back in and make an episode. Although this is not going to be like our regular episodes at all, it's not going to be in the playlist, because this is my experimental modded version of Kerbal Space Program with lots of mods installed and all sorts of stuff. I'll explain about that in a moment. But the thing that I wanted to address today was the question that one of my subscribers sent me to my email, asking me, Megneous, why in the world do we always launch to the east in Kerbal Space Program? Do people do this in real life? What is the point? Etc, etc. And that seems like a very good question to me. It's not very intuitive for many people, so I wanted to explain. So I'm also going to show off some of the mods that we have in our experimental save as well, because, I mean, eventually we're going to start a series here anyway, so we may as well. As you can see, this is the Kethane mod. This is where you can mine Kethane on Kerbal. We're not going to be using that mod today, but maybe later. So I have Kethane, I also have MacLeod, and MacLeod is a mod that basically allows an autopilot to take control of your rocket. I also have the mod Remote Tech, which you can check out right here. This blue line is a Remote Tech thing. Remote Tech is a mod which allows your probes to not be controllable unless they are within range of another, basically, control center. Your first control center is Kerbal Space Center, and I've already put a Kerbal stationary communication satellite, that's hard to say, right above Kerbal Space Center so that we can continue to control our probes as they go over the horizon of Kerbal, because usually we would lose contact with our probes then. This took quite a while to get here, but I put it in a Kerbal stationary orbit precisely so that it will stay directly over Kerbal Space Center. This took a while, this took like 2 hours. I lost many rockets, it makes me sad. But we're not talking about that this episode. This episode we're going to be talking about why, precisely, we launch rockets to the east in Kerbal Space Program rather than the west. So, with this in place so that we can keep track of our probes, let's go ahead and actually I want to show this guy off. This is an ion thruster probe. It has lots of xenon. It has giant solar sails to power it. It's pretty cool. It's awesome. I like it. And this dish will hopefully allow us to communicate later with, like, the moon and Megneous when we send things out there. Pretty cool stuff. I think that this is probably one of my prettiest satellites I've ever made, just to show that off. Alright, so let's go back to the Space Center. Now, what I'm going to do in order to show you guys exactly why we launch things to the east, both in real life as well as in Kerbal Space Program, I'm going to launch the exact same rocket using MacLeod, so that everything is the same and it's controlled by autopilot, so you don't have to worry about my crappy piloting changing the results. We are going to launch the exact same rocket, both prograde and retrograde, going around Kerbal to the east as well as to the west, using the exact same rocket while looking at the Delta V stats down here that MacLeod is so kind to provide us with. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that we have 8,748 meters per second Delta V in vacuum for this rocket. We're going to keep track of the vacuum just because, so we don't get it mixed up with the in-atmosphere Delta V. In order to do this, let's see, we're going to change the orbital altitude from MacLeod to 70 kilometers. An orbital inclination of 0 degrees means that it's going to go to the east. So we're going to go ahead and engage the autopilot. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, launch. I did not click. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, launch. Yay, there we go. Liftoff. We have liftoff of the COM satellite. So again, this rocket started off with 8,748 Delta V. This will be the same as the rocket that goes to the west instead. We're going to launch both, and we're going to look at the Delta V stats down here after we reach a 70 by 70 orbit. And we're going to see what the difference is. Now, if we look here in the map view, we are currently not doing our gravity turn. We are just going straight up. We are ascending, but we already have a parabola. We already have a bend in our parabola where our rocket will go, where we land to the east. And that's sort of strange, because you would think if we're going up, why are we going to land to the east? And the reason for that is that planets, as you can probably guess and already know, they rotate. Now, there's no coincidence in the fact that Kerbal Space Center is directly on the equator in Kerbin. Kerbal Space Program has pretty realistic physics as long as you ignore the whole air thing. The drag models and stuff are terrible, the atmospheric simulation is really bad, but in terms of the equatorial thing going on that I'm about to explain, it's very accurate. See, when planets rotate, at their equators they're rotating faster than, say, if you were at the pole. Let's say you have Jebediah Kerman, and he's just chilling at exactly the North Pole. Is he moving anywhere, really? He's moving around the sun, yes, but he's not moving with the planet other than just spinning. If you move just spinning at the North Pole, then you don't really have any momentum going around the planet. If you launch a rocket from the pole, you're going to have to make all of your orbital velocity on your own via your rocket. However, for our rocket here, that's launching from the equator, it's already moving around Kerbin. Now, it's not moving around Kerbin that quickly, but the fact that the equator moves faster gives you essentially a little boost in speed. Your velocity is already up there a little bit in order to give you a little boost to get into orbit. It's also no coincidence that in real life, launch providers such as SpaceX and Boeing, etc., all try to get their launch pads as close to the equator as possible. This is why there are launch pads like crazy in Florida, as well as southern Texas. There aren't that many launch pads, in New York City. Well, large population probably has a lot to do with that as well, but launching a rocket from New York City is much less efficient than launching one from, say, I don't know, Key Largo or Cape Canaveral, anywhere to the south, basically. The closest that you can get to the equator, the better. The equator doesn't really pass through that many land masses in real life, so it's not really that great for us. Florida's not as close to the equator as we would like to get, but it's certainly a lot better than anywhere further north. Now, in Kerbal Space Program, Kerbal Space Center is exactly on the equator to make it easier for newbies to get into orbit. You can of course get into orbit from anywhere else on Kerbin, it's not that hard, it doesn't require that much delta V, but it's just easier from here, so that's a good reason for it to be there. We also encourage people to try to get into orbit going to the east because of the boost of velocity. Also, another reason that the Kerbal Space Center is on the equator is because this little dude right here, the moon, is also in an equatorial orbit, which, by the way, in real life our moon is not. So it's a little bit more difficult to get to the moon in real life than Kerbal Space Program, to say the least, but a lot of that also has to do with orbital mechanics rather than just the fact that this is a video game. Our moon is more similar to Megneous, actually. So it looks like MacLeod is almost done getting into orbit. We just look at it here. It looks like it's coasting to its apoapsis. Coasting to the edge of the atmosphere, it says right here. So in terms of MacLeod, I think the MacLeod is a very, very useful tool. I think even if you don't use the autopilot, you can use it to aim your rocket. You can use it for delta V stats, which is the primary use that I use it for here in my experimental save. I think that delta V stats are something that you should definitely have when you're playing Kerbal Space Program. I'm not really sure why it's not included in the stock game yet, especially since with the 0.22 update coming we also get subassembly. So we can get subassembly, but we can't get delta V stats. Seems a little strange to me. Maybe Squad thinks that we shouldn't, bother customers with math. Maybe they want to skip on the math and not make people afraid to fly rockets and think they have to use math. But I think that delta V is very, very useful. Well, information on delta V is useful for building rockets so that you can build an actual scientifically designed rocket to do a particular goal, as opposed to what I do in the stock game and just make everything as big as possible, right? Alright, so we are in our 70 by 70 orbit. Let's see, that's 70 right there, and 69.8. Yeah, that's close enough, about 200 meters. Not bad, MacLeod, not bad. So we're basically in a circular orbit. We got there, and what is the difference? We currently have 4,183 meters per second delta V left. That is a difference from our 8,748 to 4,183. That is a total difference of 4,565 delta V. So it took 4,565 delta V to get into a circular 70 by 70 orbit above the atmosphere. Now that's very important to remember. I will remind you of that again, but let's go back to the Space Center, and we will launch a secondary rocket. This time, instead of going to the east, we are going to launch it to the west, going against the rotation of Kerbal. Comsat, and launch. Jebediah, Bill, and Bob, I'm sorry, but we're not going to be using any crewed launches today because everything can be instead done by probes. Alright, there's our physics. So 70 kilometers again. For our inclination, we're doing 180, which is the exact opposite of 0 in terms of orbits and stuff. Again, we have 8,748 meters per second delta V available in vacuum. Let's go ahead and turn on our autopilot. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we have liftoff of the comms satellite. Very good. So MacLeod is going to take care of that. We don't have to worry about that. Looking at it here in the map, turn this around again. What you're going to see is our parabola right here, our flight path, is going to start off basically the same as it did for the eastern launch at first, because we're currently still only ascending. We haven't yet made our gravity turn. So what you're going to see soon, when we get to approximately 7.5 kilometers, I think that's when MacLeod starts doing its gravity turn, a little bit sooner than most people do when they play themselves. I think 10 kilometers is usually where people do their gravity turn. But MacLeod is totally awesome at his job, so I trust him. I trust MacLeod. Alright, so it looks like we have about 2 more kilometers until we start our gravity turn. But this is exactly the same so far as our launch to the east. We have the same rocket, we're currently doing an ascension, and the first difference is going to come up right here. We are currently doing our gravity turn to the west. So let's watch what happens to our parabola. As you can see, usually we would fall to the east, but now that we're doing our gravity turn, we have to spend our delta V. We're spending our fuel and spending our efficiency to not only negate that velocity going to the east that we get naturally via the rotation of Kerbal, but now to also send it back going to, there goes our first stage. Let's make sure that it's still going. Yes, it is. Alright, so our first stage is done, but that's okay. We have all of the fuel that we need. And now we're going to work very, very hard to get this parabola to go to the west, to get into a retrograde orbit. Now the cool thing about having MacLeod is that it's so precise that this satellite we just put up is in a 70 by 70 circular orbit going prograde. It's going counterclockwise. It's going counterclockwise around Kerbal along with the rotation of Kerbal. It's going at approximately 2.3 kilometers per second. That's pretty fast. Not as fast as in real life when we're in real low Earth orbit for Earth, but it's still going pretty fast. So 2.3 kilometers per second. When we get this little communication satellite into a 70 by 70 orbit, since we're on the same inclination, and we're in the same 70 by 70 orbit, we're actually in the same orbit as this comm satellite, but we're going in the opposite direction, meaning that our relative velocities are actually combined. So this one's going at 2.3 kilometers per second. This one's going at 2.3 kilometers per second. That means that together, when they pass one another, which they will, by the way, when they pass one another, they're going at approximately 4.6 kilometers per second past one another relative velocity. That's really fast. Still not as fast as we have to go to reach low Earth orbit, I believe, but still pretty fast. In Kerbal Space Program, you can indeed hit satellites and run into wreckage and things like that, as I'm sure many of you have done. I'm sure you've lost a solar panel or two maybe to debris. But, you know, because the physics of Kerbal Space Program aren't calculated when you're not in control of a rocket, you actually have to be in control of your spacecraft to have a chance of hitting something and then blowing up. Satellites aren't going to hit one another if you're not currently controlling a rocket, so don't worry about that. But it is possible if you're controlling your rocket and you're not warping, because warp also cancels collisions. But if you're not warping, then yes, you can totally run into things, and terrible, terrible things can happen. But that's probably not going to happen for us, because very, very, very tiny miscalculations by MacJeb, incredibly small, you have no idea, will get us into just enough of a different orbit to where we can see, maybe within like 300 meters, the other comms satellite may come by, but we still won't be in exactly the same orbit, so we don't have to worry too much about hitting one another. Not yet. Not yet. Let's see, we are currently coasting to the edge of the atmosphere. We are currently in a very, very small amount of atmosphere, but I believe that's 67.8 kilometers or something like that. We should be out of the atmosphere now. Very good. There's our maneuver node. Alright, so that's 511 meters per second of delta V we're going to use to circularize our orbit. We still have plenty of fuel. The little guy right here, our ion thrusters, we don't even use them to get to orbit. This stage right here will be more than enough to get to orbit for this guy. There's our space music. Yeah, I guess space music doesn't cut in after the end of the atmosphere. I guess technically it cuts in after 70 kilometers. Alright, that's good to know. And come on, cut. You know you want to. Alright, very good. So if we check our map, we should be in basically the exact same orbit as our other one. Yes indeed, 70 by 69.8, so basically the same orbit, just going in a retrograde. So this was going to the west. This means that we should have used more delta V to get here than we used going to the east. So let's check it. We started off with 8,748, and for the eastern going rocket, we ended with 4,183. As you can see here, this is 3,701, which means that we used a total of 5,047 delta V to get to orbit, whereas the eastern going rocket, the prograde rocket, was 4,565. That is a difference in delta V usage, a difference in efficiency of 482 delta V. Now, compared to our total of 8,748, that's not that big. But if you consider the fact that we used going to the east 4,568 delta V, and our waste going to the west is approximately 482, that's about 10%. So we used 10% more delta V, 10% more fuel to get into orbit going in a retrograde direction as opposed to a prograde with the rotation of Kerbal. And that is precisely why in Kerbal Space Program we will almost always go to the east unless we have a special want for a satellite. I'm not really sure why we would need to go into a retrograde, but in real life sometimes we do. I do believe. So this is why going with the rotation of a planet is so good. It saves us on fuel, saves us efficiency, and that means that we can, send more to orbit. If I were to change the weight of our payloads, this means that I can get probably like an additional, I don't know how many more tons I could get to orbit with an additional about 500 delta V, but it's a very real number. We have about 1 minute left, so I would like to go around and meet. We are currently still in communication status because our Kerbal stationary comm satellite allows us to stay in contact with the Kerbal Space Center. But when we go around here, we're actually going to lose contact. I want to see this comm satellite and this comm satellite pass by one another. It looks like it's going to happen around the periapsis, actually. And there we go. We are currently out of contact. We can no longer control our rocket. We can no longer do anything. We can't use MacJeb. We can't do anything with this rocket whatsoever. So let's get pretty close. And we're moving relative speed of about 4.6 kilometers per second. Let's move this down to double speed, or times 5, I guess. Alright. That's good enough for me. So let's look around Kerbal. There we go. So that's currently at 47 kilometers, 35 kilometers. We can now see the name 20 kilometers. Here goes. Phew! Yeah, and that is what it looks like when you pass by another satellite going at 4.6 kilometers per second. So that basically explains the full answer to the question why we always launch to the East in Kerbal Space Program and in real life as well. Thank you very much everyone for watching. My name is Megneous. Let me know below in the comments if you would like to see a new series of Kerbal Space Program, and I will see you next time.